Good evening and welcome to Your Idaho, where we discuss issues facing our state and its citizens. This program is brought to you by the GemStatePatriot.com, an Idaho-based electronic newsletter. My name is Bob Neugebauer. I'm the publisher of GemStatePatriot.com, and this is my co-host, Steve Ackerman, who's our managing editor. Tonight we'll be talking about the minimum wage. Is it good or is it bad? Steve, I'd like to start off by talking about the typical effects of raising a minimum wage. Four things usually happen. You usually wind up reducing hiring, cutting your workforce, reducing benefits, or raising prices. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
You bet. And let's go to slide number 1, if we could. And if you take a look at this, and I'm going to start out with what an economist would do here. You see here a typical supply and demand graph. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see the number 130, which is called the equilibrium quantity. And then you'll see over on the left side, okay, along the vertical, the number 15, which is the equilibrium price. What that is saying is that is the market clearing price for the amount of money that would be paid for a typical worker. In other words, you have 100 workers and you have 100 businesses or businesses that want to hire 100 workers, or 130, I'm sorry, you have 130 workers, and those 130 workers can be hired at a price of $15 an hour, okay? Market clearing, right? The number of people that want to work are being hired by the number of businesses that want to hire them. Now, if you impose, and we could go back to slide 1 again, have that up on the camera. If you go to what's called a price floor, which is what a minimum wage is. A price floor says that the amount that people pay cannot be any lower than some number, right? So think of the minimum wage. You cannot pay lower, right, or less than $7.25 an hour. And what the president wants to go to 10.10. Exactly. Right. So he's saying that no one can be paid less than $10.10 an hour. Well, if you notice on this graph where it shows $20, let's say the minimum wage was $20. The equilibrium price to clear those 130 workers is $15, but the government has set a minimum wage of no less than $20 an hour. So whatever people are doing for $15 an hour, they have to be paid by law $20 an hour. Well, obviously, if I can get $5 an hour more for doing something, I'm more likely to do it, right? I'm going to attract more people into it. So what you'll see there on the graph, on the supply curve on the right, is that since you're paying more for the same job, you're attracting 50 more workers. So you have more people who want to do this particular job. However, because it costs more per worker, because of the minimum wage, you only have 90 businesses that want to hire, right? Only 90 jobs being made available by whatever number of businesses, okay? So you have a shortfall, okay? And that shortfall is called unemployment. You have an excess number of workers to the number that want to be hired. And that is a core effect of the minimum wage, is that essentially, and let's go to slide 2, is that essentially you create excess workers because you have new people that want to join these jobs, but businesses either can't afford to pay them or are unwilling to do it. And so at the end of the day, you have fewer jobs available. And that is called unemployment. The second problem is because you have fewer jobs available, you have less economic activity. You have less things being made, less purchases going on, fewer people getting a wage so they can't buy things. So guess what? Fewer exchanges. You slow down economic activity. And that connects to everything that people do, like buying gas for their car to drive to this job. Well, if they don't have a job, they don't buy gas, so now you don't need as many gas stations. So it starts perpetuating upon itself with more unemployment. And then finally, the worst, I think, that you and I have talked about a lot, Bob, and that is that who does it affect most? Well, if I'm an employer and I have to hire, I'm looking to hire somebody and I'm told I have to pay $5 an hour more, am I going to hire somebody with more experience or less? So it's the youth, the people who don't have that job experience, right? Don't have the skills. They get affected quite negatively.
Well, and when you take a look at the minimum wage, typically two categories, those 16 to 24 and those 25 and over. and a little over half are between the 16 and 24 age group,
Right.
and the balance are 25 or old, but typically they're not the sole family breadwinners.
That's right.
When you also look at 62% are currently enrolled in school, and 22% actually live below the poverty level.
Right.
So we understand where the minimum wage group is. These are the people that are most affected every time we change the minimum wage. And you were talking about the economist that worked for Obama in the first part of his administration, Raymer.
Yep.
And she was talking about what would happen, in particular, if you raise taxes.
Yes.
All right.
That's right.
And you get the same effect when you raise the minimum wage.
That's right. She found that for every percent every percent of tax increase that you impose, you have a corresponding cut in economic growth. So higher taxes lead to less economic growth. And that makes sense because basically you're adding that tax on to the price of that good, and thus fewer people can afford to buy them. And again, who does it hurt most? Working poor, people of low income, because they're the first who are not able to afford something.
Sure. Just to go back for a little history for our viewers, the Fair Labor Standard Act, FSLA, started back in 1938, and the first minimum wage was 25 cents an hour. You know, the last minimum wage increase occurred in 2007 at $5.15, and it rose till 2009 to $7.25. So if you take a look at it today, the minimum wage buys somewhat more than the minimum wage has historically, although it remains over $1 an hour below its historical high. So we're not really making any headway here.
Right. But we're imposing some costs. Because again, you know, one of the problems we have, right, is that if you have a 16-year-old trying to get a job and they're told there's a minimum wage, it's difficult for them to overcome, you know, making the argument, I'm really worth that much more money. In a free market system, what would that 16-year-old do? The 16-year-old would say, well, pay me half that wage for the first 6 months, and while I gain my skills, then I'll come back for a raise. But after I've proven it, or let's say the 16-year-old's family pays the employer a couple $100s in training costs. Again, though, richer people can afford to do that. Poor people can't afford to do that.
Well, if you take a look at the people who are in the minimum wage jobs, again, they only stay there for approximately a year, and then they raise themselves up to the next level. But, you know, most of the time, the laid-off minimum wage people are not rehired, so it's a form of attrition. You don't see the firing take place, but it's a matter of attrition over a period of time.
Interesting.
So it's kind of hard to sit down and count, well, how many have left? Well, the fast food industry is a typical example, and that's a huge turnover there. People are coming and going all of the time.
Yeah.
You know, we get back to this. The politicians, they always want to mess around with the economy, but you don't mess around with economics.
Yeah.
And when it comes right down to it, one of the first laws of economics is if you raise the price of something, somebody's going to buy a lot less of it.
Yes.
You know, typical is gasoline. We saw what happened when they raised the price, going up from $2.50 to $3.50 over the last year or two.
Yeah.
And how much less gasoline we're using. Now, of course, some of that is because the consumption is cut back by better mileage. But there's a definite usage directly attributed to the price of the gas.
And that affects the delivery of the gas, the truckers, that affects gas stations, that affects, that's right, that's right.
Well, I'd like to try and touch base. The Minimum Wage Study Commission back in 1981. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that.
You know, they showed professional consensus to be that a 10% increase in a minimum wage reduces teenage employment by 1 to 3%, since that's a proxy for low-skilled workers. So why do we want to erect barriers, you know, to employment when we're still coming out of an anemic recovery, almost as bad as the Great Depression?
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you look at, and you and I have talked about this, if you look at incomes, you find that after your typical recessions, if you go back to the recession of 81 and 82, and even the 2001-2002 recession, you saw that incomes over the next 5 years have gone up by 34%. Incomes this time, after the 2007-2008 recession, they've gone up maybe 6%.
Right.
So stagnant incomes all around. And, you know, when it comes to youth, I mean, you know, we know that what's called that U6 number, which takes into account the part-time and temporary workers, many of them being those 16 and 17-year-olds trying to save for college, save for a car, you know, et cetera. That's almost double our unemployment rate. So, you know, we hear 5.5%, and that's fine. That's better than the national average. But if you account for part-time and temporary, where a lot of those youth are at, it's more than double. It's 10.5, 11%.
Well, I can understand that. And when you take a look at what's happened to wages in general over the last 5 to 6 or 7 years, you know, Idaho's median income for a family of 4 was, in 2007, I believe, $60,400 a year. That is now at a $54,500 level.
Oh my gosh.
Now that's a huge number.
That is a huge
You
number.
wonder why you have unemployment. You wonder why you have so many people looking for a minimum wage rise.
Right.
But
Right.
it's kind of scary for people out there in this economy that we have here. And of course, you know, we have some of the lowest paying jobs in the country.
Yeah, we're number one in percent of minimum wage
Yeah,
per
number
capita.
50
That's right.
in the States.
Right, that's right.
We're getting down there with
Yes.
Mississippi with all the statistics.
Yes, we're not doing well.
I just want to touch again on, you know, how we're going to get out of this problem we have here and get some good paying jobs. One of the ideas that has been advanced by several of the politicians running is that we take our lands back from the feds. And, you know, that's 62% of our land is covered by the feds.
Yeah.
So when you take a look at what's going on the use of the forest products, which has been, it was huge 20, 30 years ago. I saw mills closed here when I first came. They could increase probably by $1 billion a year the GDP of the state.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But they're not allowing us to cut the timber and use the timber.
That's right. The density level is much higher than a normal healthy density level, and you know, people don't always appreciate that. But you know, when you have an excess of density, you essentially have more trees seeking the same amount of water,
Right.
and not every tree is going to get adequate water, and so it's going to die and it's going to become fuel for fire, and hence, you know, the horrendous fires we've had this last year was tremendous, but even the year before that, this is part of why they're getting a lot worse, and of course costing money and imposing health problems with all that pollution that goes in the air and all the killing of various species. I mean, federal neglect is really doing environmental damage to Idaho.
It doesn't seem like the federal government really cares about the fires that take place. What they really care about is the wood-burning stoves and the particulate matter in them.
Yes.
Now, have you ever heard such a crazy idea?
Right. Yeah,
And
that is
we don't seem to be doing anything in this state to change that. We haven't put any viable rules in telling them we're not going to deal with this.
Right.
What are all of the people who've got wood-burning stoves or pellet-burning stoves going to do if they install those EPA regulations and impose them on Idaho?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, and yet we're watching all of this, you know, the millions of board feet not be captured, and hence creating higher paying jobs in the timber industry, let alone the minerals that are in the ground. I mean, you and I have been around the state, and we've talked with people who have pointed out all of the minerals beyond things like silver, but minerals that are used in various industrial capacities. And I mean, these are also high paying.
You know, we have one of the most promising veins of rare earth in the world right here in Idaho through the Lemhi Pass, Salmon, Diamond Creek, and the North Fork. If we were to mine those minerals, there is no telling how much we could take out of the ground and do it effectively without causing any changes to the environment.
That's right.
But we still can't get at that. You know, when you look at what happened with North Dakota, their GDP grew by 7% last year, and that was just from oil.
Yeah.
And we don't have an enormous amount of oil here. I've talked to several people. Everybody worries about fracking. There is no fracking going on in Idaho.
Right.
You know, they're all fracking crazy. But let's get back to the minimum wage here. You know, 70% of Idaho are small businesses, and a lot of them are service businesses. These are mom and pop shops.
Yes.
What would happen if we raised the minimum wage to $9 or $9.10 here?
They would really be in a conundrum because the problem they would face is, number one, the obvious hiring problem that we talked about earlier. They simply wouldn't be able to hire people. But the other problem is that they don't necessarily have the investment capital to put into automation and other kinds of technology. And look, you even have the legislature now talking about online sales tax. I'm not sure where that is at the moment, but that got brought up a little while before. That might be the one area where if they were not taxed online, they had they had an outlet. They could make a sale. In fact, there's a store, Alpine store up in Adams County, and I was talking to them. They were shipping smoked beef jerky to Florida.
Wow.
When I walked in there and sat down, grabbed a quick sandwich, traveling back from Idaho County the other day, I was listening to the orders. And I asked her, I said, how do you what percentage of this is of your, she said, I don't know the exact percent, but it's growing by leaps and bounds. And she said, if we didn't have this online ability and the shipping, I said, well, what would happen with an online sales tax? She says, I don't even want to go there.
Now, that's the tax that Luna brought up, isn't it?
That's the tax that Luna brought up.
Because he wanted to raise some more money for the schools?
Yes.
Has he ever thought of maybe trying to consolidate the districts and saving some money?
Good point.
I don't think that's kind of hit him yet, but he's gone anyway. It doesn't matter. So now we're looking at the minimum wage and the studies that have been done. I don't think anybody's talking about how Obamacare is going to affect the minimum wage.
That's a good point.
Because it's going to drive prices even higher.
Yeah.
Obamacare requires many employers with 50 or more employees to offer qualifying health care for their full-time workers. And I know you're well aware of that, knowing all the work you've done on health care. Now, this coverage is expensive. By 2015, it's going to add $2.24 per hour to the cost of employing a worker with single coverage.
So 1010 becomes 1235
That's
an hour.
correct. That's correct. So
okay.
I don't think anybody looks at these numbers. I'm certainly that our president hasn't looked at them because he's all talking about 1010.
Right.
And the CBO is talking about how many jobs we're going to lose, like in the hundreds of thousands.
Yes, I remember you were talking about that. Yep.
The other thing is, they're going to have to provide coverage or face a fine of $2,000 per employee.
Right.
That comes out to, in tax dollars, all right, pre-tax payroll costs are going to be $1.64 an hour, pre-tax. All right, these costs are on top of all the other government mandates.
Yes.
Now, that means you're required to pay the minimum wage, the employer share of payroll taxes, and unemployment insurance. Now, how in heaven's name can anybody think that raising the minimum wage is going to create a better economic situation here in Idaho or any place in the country?
Yeah, I don't see how it could happen. And when you go to your point about mandates, you have another problem. And you have the problem that, and we've already seen it for the last 2 years, the average deductible has gone up by 100%. And you and I both know that the deductibles are going to continue to go higher because insurance companies are saying very simply, when you impose rules on any product, what happens? They have to pass the cost along. Well, one way to pass the cost along is to raise the deductible. Make the worker have to eat up more of that deductible.
Right.
So you have fewer people working, and yet those who are working, getting a little more from that minimum wage, that's going to get taken away in terms of the deductible. So they're still no better off. And but to go to your question directly, put it in the context of the 70% of businesses that are small business. They're not going to be able to handle all these mandates.
Well, and I don't think the government, and particularly right now in this state government we have, I don't think they're looking out for the small businesses. I get the impression that they're more interested in large businesses, like the Chobani yogurts or the Microns or the fruit bars or, the Tutti Frutti kids, whatever it is.
Right.
But as long as it has a lot of employees.
Yes.
I don't see anybody saying anything about the 1,600 employees that were laid off from the call center.
That's right, the Maximus layoff. That's true. Yeah. Based on the Affordable Care Act, they said there weren't enough phone calls coming in. And I think April 25th they're going to do it. So 10 days after tax day, they're going to
Right, and they were
face a
making more
layoff.
than minimum wage.
Yes, they were.
I mean, they weren't making a lot of money, but up into $12, $12.50 an hour.
That's right. It was a few dollars.
And then we've got this potential for some of these base closings coming up.
Yes, we also have that. That's true.
So how are we going to institute a minimum wage here? We're losing these jobs hand over fist, and it's going to continue on for the next couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Putting that or installing that in this state would be disastrous. I mean, it would cause economic disaster.
Yeah, I don't see how. I don't see how our. I mean, I think the bottom line is many of those 70%, because they don't have investment capital, or they don't have a lot of investment capital to automate or implement new technologies. Some of them are simply going to go out,
Sure.
and that's going to lead to consolidation of larger businesses. So we're going to end up having, just big businesses. Those are, as you say, those are the only ones being incentivized. They're the only ones that can kind of take these hits. But it's still going to be economic slowdown. And, small business is really where you have the best training, the development. It's how you learn how to interact with customers the best. It's also, in the long run, that's where a lot of your inventions and ideas have come from. We're small businesses. If you look at a company like Apple, Apple has continued to be innovative, but not as innovative as when they first started. Now that they're much larger, people like to point purely to Steve Jobs, clearly an inspiration. However, a lot of the early creativity, and Microsoft was the same way, a lot of that early creativity really came from, and the patents show it, came from when they were small and growing. Small businesses do so much in how they, as partners with large corporations, et cetera, they're really the idea creators. And that's how an economy thrives.
Well, I agree with you, and I don't see an awful lot of that happening here. And, we're still picking winners and losers, and instituting the minimum wage is just another government intervention. It's no different than when they take $260 million of our tax dollars and they incentivize businesses with investment tax credits.
Yes.
Why in heaven's name are we doing that? I mean, do you really think it drives business here? I don't think it does. And what happened, I would prefer to see a business come in here, all right, and say, okay, you're tax-free for 5 years, corporate profits. You fixed all the infrastructure. You put everything in that you need.
Right.
And then all we do is gain the amount of money that we're getting from the employees they bring in, and that broadens the tax base.
Yes. That's
but
right.
We're not putting out that extra money, that $260 million.
Yes.
If you could phase that out over a period of years and phase in a new system like New York does now, they'll give you
10-year.
Yeah, 10-year free tax.
Yes.
Wow. Well,
yes.
With the taxes in New York, you need 10 years to catch up. In Idaho, it's not quite that bad.
That's right, but it would make us much more competitive. And one of the things we do need to think about is that we are in competition with the Utahs and Nevadas and Oregons and et cetera. I mean, we are in competition with them. And, for mining, they go to Nevada. For energy, they go to Wyoming. For Montana, they go to, for logging, they go to Montana. To go back to your land's point, they could stay here for all of that. But at the end of the day, that tax issue has to be thought of in the context that we are in competition with these other states.
Well, I sure like to see some kind of a different attitude here in Idaho. Instead of giving the tax money away, have the companies come in. You're not giving anything up. If you bring a company in here and they bring in 100 employees and they're getting paid at $18 or more an hour,
yes.
And I'm talking high-tech companies,
right?
Then certainly you can afford to give up that base of corporate profits until they recover all of the money they put in for infrastructure and building and
yes.
hiring and training. And certainly 5 years would probably be plenty to do that and phase out that $260 million, because I hear this government here, the state government, is trying to put more money into that program.
Yes,
which is just, as far as I'm concerned, a waste of tax dollars.
And I don't think it's being utilized very heavily. I think that's another problem. I mean, the information I pick up is that several of these programs are simply not being not being used by companies.
But how can you tell? Because we're one of 13 states that has no transparency on all of this money we give out. None.
That's right.
You can't find out what's given out or who gets it or when they get it.
Yeah, it's all anecdotal.
I'd just like to go back for a minute here, and I have some numbers that I picked up. And that's that in 2015, on an hourly basis, assuming that the minimum wage does not change from the current $7.25.
Right.
All right. The minimum wage cost to an employer, minimum wage staying at $7.25 would be $9.90 an hour if the employer carried health insurance.
Right.
And if they chose the penalty, it would be $9.72 an hour. So there's not really a heck of a lot of difference.
Right. Right.
My point here is, how are we going to raise the minimum wage up to $9? And then on top of that, we're going to have to add on another almost $3.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that that's one of the reasons why Senator Stennett's bill didn't go very far.
Yeah, I hope they kill that in the Senate.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we've got through most of this stuff here tonight. Is there anything else you want to bring up?
No, I think your point though about the 5-year phase out or a 5-year no taxes is a very interesting one. I think it's an interesting one just from an incentive standpoint because again we are in competition and we do have the surrounding states are states that include states that don't have a sales tax, or they might not have a corporate income tax, or they might not have a personal income tax.
Well, plus that, you could take that $260 million. I mean, the governor keeps saying we need new roads. Let's get another gas tax. The teachers say they need more money. Well, you've got a big kitty there to divide up $260 million over a 5-year period.
Yes.
I would think everybody would be pretty happy to get that on both sides.
Yes.
And we have better infrastructure here.
Yes, that's right. It should make the budget negotiations a little more friendly, right? A little easier to do.
Yeah, I would think so. You know, everybody would be happier, and certainly our taxes probably wouldn't go up much more.
Yes.
At least not on the sales tax side. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And I hope to see you next week at the same time. If you're up early on Saturday morning, you can catch me from 5 to 8 on the Kevin Miller Show, KIDO 580 AM radio. It's a conservative talk show, and we talk very conservatively every place we go. I'd like to thank the technicians and the staff of TVC-TV for making this broadcast possible. They're a nonprofit organization, and if you can donate a few dollars, please do so by going to their website. It's www.tvctv.org. Thank you and good night, Idaho.